Good evening and welcome to What's Your Story? I'm your host, James Ransom Reed Jr. This is the second part of an interview I have with my guest, Mr. Jack Hale, on the Coltsville National Historical Park. Please make sure you see part one. It was filled with a lot of information that may surprise you. You may just learn something. And I know in this next segment, you're going to learn even more. So let's get right to it. Jack, welcome back. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, James.
Now tell me, what is Arm Smear? What is that?
Arm Smear is the Colt mansion. It was built by Sam while he and Elizabeth were on their honeymoon in Europe for 6 months. It's in a big Italianate building. At the time it was built, it was the largest house in Hartford. Pretty impressive. It's right on Wethersfield Avenue, which was remarkable. Usually people who were building fancy houses would set them back from the street. Mm-hmm. But Sam wanted to tell everybody he was successful, and so he put his house right on the street.
So the name Arm Smear, that's kind of unusual. What is that all about, do you know?
Yeah, arms refers to guns, and mere means meadow. So it's Gun Meadow is what the house's name is. The factory was built in what was called the South Meadows at the time. Okay. It was a swamp until Sam built his dike around it.
Wow. All right, Colts Park. People have been in there for decades.
Yes.
How'd it come to be, and what's it all about, and why was it there?
It was Sam and Elizabeth's backyard. They had a very large estate to go with their very large house. And when Elizabeth died in 1905, she left all of that space to the city of Hartford for a park.
It was their backyard?
Yeah. Well, they had a deer park, they had a pond, they had a sculpture garden, they had a greenhouse that was 1,000 feet long. They had a lot of money, and they didn't mind spending it.
You talked a little bit about the Church of the Good Shepherd. Now, etched in the building of the Church of the Good Shepherd are, shall we say, references to firearms? Is that fair?
Yeah, there sure are. Elizabeth had a problem when she built the church. She wanted to invite the workers from the factory in, but her friends who would have followed her into the church were all rich.
All right.
And the workers in the factory weren't. And she wanted to make sure that they felt welcome. So on one special entrance to the church, not the main entrance, but one that kind of pointed at where the workers lived, there are guns worked into the decorative stone carvings around that door. So the idea was for them to see something familiar and to understand that that was for them.
When you give people tours, as you do, right? You give tours.
Oh, yeah.
And how does one set up a tour to see the Church of the Good Shepherd or the parish house or what have you? How does that happen?
Sometimes I just meet people who are interested and we set it up, but otherwise people can call the church office. And they'll connect with me and we'll set something up.
Set something up. What's the average length of the tour? Does it depend on the number of people? Or?
As you can tell, if you get me started, it can last quite a while. I tell people that a full tour takes an hour and a half.
Okay.
But I can control myself and get by with less time than that.
Okay. The World Series is going on right now. Baseball. Baseball has something to do with the Colt National Park. There's a field there, is there not?
There is.
What is that field, and what was it there for, and who played there?
Yeah. In the 1870s, baseball was going beyond an amateur sport. And Morgan Bulkley, who people may know, he was the governor of Hartford, he was the mayor of or he was the mayor of Hartford, the governor of Connecticut, a founder of Aetna Insurance. They had a baseball team called the Hartford Dark Blues, based on the color of their uniform. He wanted to build a stadium where they could play. At that point, the Church of Good Shepherd was there, but the parish house was not. And so Morgan Bulkley arranged to use this big piece of property in front of the church, or across the street from the church, as the location for the stadium for his team. And so he built what at that time was the finest stadium in what became the National League. The Hartford team was among the first 9 in that league. And they played in this amazing stadium for 3 years before moving to the Bronx and taking a different name. But it was a huge draw. The other teams just loved coming to play because the stadium really was the best around. And the games were so popular that at some points they closed the state legislature so that the legislators could come to watch a baseball game.
Now, there's a marker or something on the field now that where it was played, where the stadium was, right?
Yeah, there are 12-inch square marble blocks that mark the bases and the pitcher's mound and the best we could do to locate them precisely where they were in the original field.
Jack, tell me something. What is Potsdam Village? What is that?
Well, I mentioned a little while ago that Sam needed to dry out the meadows, and he built a dike to surround his property and keep the Connecticut River from washing into it. Mm-hmm. And he planted on the dike, willows, which are well known for a fibrous root system that likes to be near water. And that was to stabilize the dike, so it wasn't just a pile of dirt. Once he was an entrepreneur and an opportunist, and once he had willows, he said, "Oh my gosh, I need to make wicker." So he built a wicker factory, and he wanted to hire craftsmen from Germany. And so he built worker housing, 9 of them, I think, that look like houses that they would have lived in over in Europe. And that's Potsdam Village. And that's where his the factory was right behind those houses. And that's where a lot of his craftspeople lived, and those are still there.
What is the connection of the Colt family to Cedar Hill Cemetery? For those who don't know about Cedar Hill, it was one of the early, what they call the rural cemeteries. So unlike older cemeteries where it's just rows and rows of headstones, this was a landscaped area, winding roads, big monuments. And Elizabeth Colt was aware of this new cemetery at the time that her son Caldwell died. And so she bought this big chunk of property in the cemetery on the highest point in the cemetery, had Sam's body and the bodies of the infants all moved there, and that's also where Caldwell and then eventually Elizabeth herself were buried. The amazing pink granite stone column monument to the Colt family, and that column, that monument was built by the Batterson firm, the New England Granite, owned by James Batterson, who was the founder of Travelers Insurance. But before he got into the insurance business, his business was monuments. And what is the connection of the Colt family to the Wadsworth Athenaeum?
Well, that could be a long story. We might need another episode. But Elizabeth had been involved with James Batterson, actually, in converting what had been a community art school and various other functions into a serious art museum. And when she died, she left all of her art and a lot of other stuff to the Athenaeum, along with a big chunk of cash to add a wing to the building, which her idea would be to house all of her stuff. So if you go to the Athenaeum now, you see the original castle, and just to the right of it is a section of the building that's faced with gray stone, and it has the Colt coat of arms on it. So that's her wing, and it connects to the J.P. Morgan wing, which is bigger and farther to the right.
What about their connection to the Connecticut State Library?
Well, the Connecticut State Library includes the Museum of Connecticut History. And the museum was a repository for the gun collection of the Colt Manufacturing Company. So all of those, when the Colt Manufacturing Company didn't want to have to take care of them all anymore, and so they gave them to the State Museum. So anybody who's interested in the gun side of the Colt story, that's where to go to see what what Colt firearms are all about.
You know, as you were talking, something occurred to me. We've spoken about Samuel and Elizabeth, but I'd like to give the audience just a little more meat about these two people. Could you please, was Elizabeth educated? Was she, for the time, I don't know if that was something women were or not, or were they just marrying up? And you know what I don't know.
Well, Elizabeth was born in 1826 in Portland, Connecticut. Her father was a priest at an Episcopal church in Middletown. When she and her sister Hetty got old enough to be a little more out on their own, they went to live with her aunt, who also was named Hetty, in Hartford. And she became involved in the community there. She was educated as much as most women of means were. Not a college education, but she was literate and quite capable, and she was certainly able to run a business better than Sam, actually.
Really? She did a better job, did she?
Well, Sam was an entrepreneur and a hustler and an international gun dealer and a promoter. There are lots of stories about that. But Elizabeth is the one who took over in the middle of the Civil War, kept the factory going. She was the head of it in one way or another for 40 years until she sold it a couple of years before she died. As soon as she inherited it, she bought insurance. Sam was against insurance, and Elizabeth bought insurance, and that was lucky because the next year the factory burned to the ground. And she was able to rebuild it because she had that insurance money to work with. So it's her story is pretty amazing, and it gets on into other stuff. Her philanthropy, her art stuff, and civic projects she was involved in one thing or another. Amazing woman. I'm much more interested in her than I am in Sam.
Really? Why? Because
she was remarkable. I mentioned earlier that at the time she inherited this company, women didn't own stuff.
Yeah.
And here she was, the owner of the biggest munitions company in the United States during the Civil War. It was a big scandal. Everybody in town is like, you got to be kidding me. She doesn't know anything.
What was wrong with Sam leaving that to her?
Yeah, right. Yeah. It was like nobody could figure it out. But she stepped into the saddle. luckily, she had Elihu Root, who was the chief engineer and kept that aspect of the company going. And she also had help from her brother, Richard. But there's no question, she was engaged right on through.
Now, you talked about her philanthropic work and her involvement in the community and her building of the Church of the Good Shepherd. Do we know, is there any historical evidence of what side of the Civil War she was on, or was she neutral, or we have any indication of that? Was she for the Union, or was she for the Confederacy, or?
Well, I'd say she was supportive of the Union. She had one of her philanthropies at that time was a Soldiers' Aid Society, which was aimed at providing medical supplies and various other things for Union soldiers during the war. The Colt Manufacturing Company was selling to both sides right up until Fort McHenry. Sam was not ready to take sides until that happened. But the company sold only to the Union from there on out.
Give us an overview of Church of the Good Shepherd today as it exists.
Well, it's a small congregation. In the 1960s, it went from being an all-white church to engaging with the African-American community that was there. So at that point, it became an integrated church in the 1960s. And about 15 years ago, we started working to develop ministry with Spanish-speaking folks. And at this point, the majority of our congregation is Spanish-speaking. We're a small place, small congregation in a very expensive and fancy church. Anybody is welcome to stop by. Our service is at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning in English, and at 12:15 there's a service in Spanish with Latino music. Remarkable experiences there. Where we are now is trying to keep the buildings in shape for when the national park really gets started. Mm-hmm. And we just had a conditions assessments done on the buildings, and we've got millions of dollars worth of work to do to really bring the buildings up to appropriate and sustainable condition. And that really defines a lot of who we are right now. A lot of effort will go into that.
Let's talk about the stained glass, because when I walked into the church, that's obviously the first thing that captures the eyes, that the beauty of that glass. Where did it come from? How did Elizabeth get it in there?
Yeah, well, when the church was built, the original windows at the front and rear of it came from the Henry Sharp studio in New York, a well-known studio, although relatively new at that time. Made very, very colorful and artistic windows. And later, in the 1890s, they added on the side of the sanctuary windows from a British company called Heaton, Butler and Bain, very traditional images. And then after Elizabeth died, on the north side of the sanctuary, more windows were added from Heaton, Butler and Bain. So one thing that grabs people, I think, is the consistency of the windows. So the front and rear were of a piece and designed by the same folks, and then the ones on the sides of the sanctuary came from another company, and they all kind of came at the same time. So
what are some of the stories depicted by the glass?
Well, the one that I always point out to people is there's an image of Joseph in Egypt, where he. This is the story people think of as the coat of many colors.
Yes, indeed.
Sold into slavery by his brothers, ended up in Egypt, and became the right-hand man of the Pharaoh because he could interpret dreams.
Yes, indeed.
And the Elizabeth ordered that image there. It's the only Old Testament themed window in the whole church. Because she wanted to remind people that when Sam came to Hartford to set up his business, the city fathers treated him badly, and yet he persevered and ended up being the wealthiest, largest taxpayer, biggest property owner, et cetera, in the city. And that's what everybody recognized that's why that was there.
What was the basis of the maltreatment he received? What was that all about?
Well, his family was known in town. He was a Hartford native.
Yep.
And his father just could never quite get his feet under him financially.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So he was sort of a questionable character. And Sam, of course, was arrogant and a hustler, and people recognized that. So they weren't, and he had already gone bankrupt once, trying to get going with his firearms business. So it's not surprising that they treated him badly.
That kind of treatment. Yeah. Now, they had children, didn't they?
Well, they had 3 who died in infancy.
And
then Caldwell was the only one who survived into adulthood. So
4.
Well, there also was a stillborn child who appeared not long after Sam died.
Okay, all right.
So it depends on whether you consider that a soul or not. But that was their family. After Sam died, the family, well, even before that, Elizabeth's sister Hetty, who I mentioned before, and her brother Richard moved into Armsmere with them when they got back from their honeymoon.
Okay.
And also Elizabeth's mother and father and favorite aunt, who also was named Hetty, also lived at Armsmere. It's a big house.
Now, were there servants of African descent working at the Caldwell home and so forth?
Well, I want to know, but at this point, nobody has that information. I did notice, I was looking at the Elizabeth's will.
Yes.
And there is a gift of money to a young servant, whose name, though, was Kate Driscoll, which I noticed because that's my daughter's name.
Okay, all right, yeah.
But I suspect that Kate Driscoll was not African American.
Okay, yeah.
Hard to say. It seems likely that there were African American people involved.
It would seem to me
in the household or in the factory, but at this point, nobody's really tried to do that research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know the biographer, the preeminent biographer of Elizabeth? Since she is so interesting to you, I'm sure someone must have written biographies about her. So do you know any of the biographers?
Yeah. A local guy, Bill Hosley, was a curator at the Athenaeum and mounted an exhibit about the Colt bequest.
Yes.
Back in the 90s. And he wrote a book called Colt.
Okay.
Catchy title. That is the best overall reference on Sam and Elizabeth.
Okay. All right.
There are lots of other books about Sam or about the guns, but this is broader. And then there's a relatively new book called Revolver by a fellow named Raffensperger.
Okay.
So between those two books, that's really the best resources for people who want to read up and get ready for visiting the park.
That's all the time we have for the second part of my interview with Jack Hale about the Coltsville National Historical Park. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as I'm fond of saying, everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, I'm your host, James Ransom Reed, Jr. Good night.
The water's warm at Jaws Pond, and we're stocked full of treasures. Big or small, we buy it all. We buy and sell fast rides, power tools, vintage guitars, and so much more. Walk the plank in style with our fine jewelry, diamonds, and watches. Plus, we have a huge selection of the latest video games, including the new PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Jaws Pond, conveniently located on Meriden-Waterbury Turnpike in Southington and West Main Street in New Britain.
I'm your host, Kurt Barwis. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Lin.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Veterans Corner. My name's Chuck Wooden.
Decision for ourselves for this week, if we want to be made well.
Hi, welcome to the crack of dawn. It's Dawn Lombardi. I'm starting the painting. It's going to be the clips with some water. Love it.
He took me on the sets of Lost in Space, Batman.
Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time,